And finally, let's talk about the bizarre case of a man who has won his sex discrimination claim. So this was an electrician. He was having an argument with his supervisor on the shop floor in a warehouse. The supervisor calls him a bald cunt. There was basically the case has gone back and forth in the courts. Finally, it's been decided by a learned judge that to call a man bald is sex discrimination because men are much more likely to be bald than women. Toby, where do you stand on this? Speaking as a B word, I don't know if I can say it.
I feel like I guess Kemi must when white saviours are sort of portraying black women as being these put upon victims with no agency. I don't want an employment tribunal panel to stand up for me as a bald man and protect my rights. I feel perfectly capable of doing that myself. No, it does seem pretty silly and hard to think of bald men as a kind of beleaguered victim group who kind of join the ranks of the protected. I mean, good God.
Where's your parade?
I think it's the hirsute that deserve the protection of the Equality Act. The amount of hair washing they have to do, the expense of getting your hair cut, hairs kind of get stuck everywhere, it blocks up sinks. It's them I feel sorry for. It's them that need the full protection of the law.
I'm getting inspired to go on a march now.
Bold and proud.
Reading the news reports, this was fascinating because you essentially had first of all a tribunal and then eventually a high court judge in effect having to wrestle with these absurd arguments. So one of the ones that was being mounted by the defence, by presumably the employer in this situation, was that, well, women can be bald as well. So they were having to weigh up the significance of this. And, and then at one point, another argument that was made was by the victor in this particular case, by the gentleman who has been sexually discriminated against in question, was that it's the same thing. Someone calling you a bald cunt is the same thing as talking about a female colleague's breasts. And then the judge having to say, yes, I suppose you're right. I mean, it just shows you how absurd this has become and how... from what is supposedly presented as harassment, has basically just become a way to weaponise whatever unpleasant conversation has happened in the workplace and just think, I can use that to get... Because it wasn't the only matter in this whole criminal proceedings. It was unfair dismissal. It was all these different components. But it just... You end up with a situation in which you have... an individual pretending to be incredibly victimised by something you probably brushed off 30 seconds afterwards, and also a high court judge having to take all of these things desperately seriously. But that's where we've ended up, unfortunately.
I mean, one of the things we've discovered at the Free Speech Union is that the Equality Act can be invoked to protect free speech. People think of it as the enemy of free speech, and for the most part it is. But in some regards, it's also the friend of free speech. So the classic example is Maya Forstater successfully arguing that her gender-critical beliefs should be protected under the Equality Act, and therefore to dismiss her for expressing them is unlawful discrimination. And more and more philosophical beliefs are getting designated protected status. So veganism now is a protected belief, a belief in democratic socialism, not a belief in conservatism, but we're working on that. And in one case, we're arguing that a belief in free speech should be a protected belief, because that then opens the door to protecting people who get into trouble for exercising their right to free speech. They could say, well, I said this thing because I'm a great believer in free speech. And you can see how kind of as more and more characteristics, beliefs become protected and everyone can claim to be a victim, in a sense you go through a kind of a looking glass in which nobody's a victim anymore. If everyone's a victim, then nobody's a victim. So maybe that's, rather than try and repeal the Equality Act, maybe the way is just to kind of push it to kind of this kind of absurd lengths.
Yeah.
So everything becomes protected, everyone's a victim, and therefore nothing's protected and no one's a victim.